Welcome to the fourth and final section of Introduction to Agricultural Emergency Management, produced by the National Agricultural Biosecurity Center at Kansas State University. We hope the remaining topics will continue to pique your interest as you gain an overview of the remaining critical portions of agricultural emergency management. So far, this training has only highlighted unique challenges associated with highly contagious or foreign animal disease outbreaks on the health of the nation's livestock, but a number of other events may also adversely impact animal health, public health, and food safety. This all hazards section will contain information that is also pertinent to emergency planning for companion animals, which may be a major focus for some of you. Natural weather events such as hurricanes, blizzards, and tornadoes ravage the livestock industries unpredictably, leading to high death and economic losses. Additional accidents involving hazardous materials, known as hazmat, or chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear, known as CBRN, releases pose a substantial threat to the nation's livestock and food supply as well. A number of unique challenges arise when animals are involved in emergencies, such as safe animal handling, animal evacuation, humane euthanasia, carcass disposal, and federal support available during recovery. In light of lessons learned from events such as Hurricane Katrina, greater emphasis is being placed on creating awareness of these challenges among animal owners and livestock producers. States, livestock associations, and emergency response groups are all leading efforts to educate and assist producers in developing all hazard plans to mitigate the effects on their farm. Natural disasters strike all over the country, with Texas bearing the brunt of many. Most recently, Hurricane Harvey caused catastrophic flooding in the state, which affected over a quarter of the cattle inventory. Wildfires earlier in 2017 ravaged southwest Kansas and the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, leaving thousands of livestock dead and creating millions of dollars in economic losses. Other notable events in the past few years have included two major winter storms, which led to the loss of an estimated 33,000 head of cattle in Texas and 50,000 head of livestock in South Dakota. The next couple of slides will include a more in-depth discussion of Winter Storm Atlas as it impacted South Dakota's livestock industries. In October 2013, Winter Storm Atlas struck South Dakota, drizzling the state with up to 1 inch of rain, followed by 18 to 58 inches of wet, heavy snow. Winds were sustained at 49 miles per hour with gusts up to 60 to 70 miles per hour, and temperatures hovered around freezing with a wind chill of 12 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 4 hours. Because of the severity of the storm and because it occurred uncharacteristically early in the season, before animals had fully developed their winter coats, approximately 50,000 head of livestock were lost. Most of these were cattle, but horses, sheep, bison, and goats were also among the casualties. You may recall from the discussion in the emergency management portion of Section 1 that there are two types of declarations that can be made to provide federal assistance in the case of an event impacting animal health. In this instance, a presidential disaster declaration was made for 14 counties and 2 Native American reservations. Because of the public health and safety risks associated with the vast numbers of carcasses present, funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, were obtained for carcass disposal activities. The state and counties also provided assistance with carcass disposal by suspending regulations requiring carcasses to be disposed of within 36 hours. Allowing overweight trucks hauling carcasses to utilize highways without fines, assisting in the identification of suitable burial sites, and providing equipment to aid in the digging of burial pits. It is imperative to understand that the sheer death loss and resulting carcass disposal issues are not what led to a presidential disaster declaration in this instance, however. Presidential disaster declarations under the Stafford Act are only made once strict thresholds for individual or public damages have been met. In the case of Winter Storm Atlas passing through South Dakota, extensive damage to the private, nonprofit power infrastructure was the primary factor in getting a presidential disaster declaration. Carcass removal was an additional request that was granted because of the public health concerns associated with all of the carcasses. Even then, carcasses could only be picked up at certain locations. Workers could not go out into fields or onto private property to gather them. State animal health officials noted two primary lessons learned from Winter Storm Atlas. The first was that all livestock producers should have a plan for a mass casualty event. Officials have tried to encourage this anytime they speak somewhere or interact with livestock producers. The second notable lesson learned was that producers need to better understand the role of governmental agencies. They are not there to complete the work. Rather, they exist to facilitate response efforts, provide technical expertise, and identify resources for planning, response, and recovery. Incidents involving hazmat or CBRN can have a variety of impacts on agriculture. Biological agents easily pose the most likely threat to animal agriculture and are the focus of the majority of efforts put forth by the agricultural emergency response community. Nonetheless, chemical threats, radiological releases, or nuclear disasters can all potentially alter the course of animal agriculture as well. An incident involving chemicals would likely present itself in the form of natural toxins such as nitrate or lead poisoning or contamination of feed. While the effects of this could be widespread, it would still be limited in scope compared to a different type of event and is unlikely that animal response teams would be activated. Therefore, the discussion that follows will focus on the unique circumstances of a nuclear release. Presenting a unique set of challenges to the Agriculture Emergency Coordinator is a nuclear disaster. Unlike foot and mouth disease or a host of other animal diseases, a nuclear release can affect the safety of food products such as meat and cheese, as well as the health of people and the environment. Radiological compounds may also linger in the environment longer, creating more long-term challenges to crop and feed production. Moreover, in states where the Department of Agriculture exists separately from the animal health entity, authorities may vary between a foreign animal disease or highly contagious disease and a nuclear event. This will require additional coordination and communication when preparing for and responding to an incident. The first nuclear reactor to produce electricity did so in December 1951 in Idaho. As of April 2017, 449 nuclear power plants in 30 countries provide approximately 11% of the world's electricity. With so many reactors in operation and more under construction, it comes with no surprise that there have been a number of accidents throughout history. Fortunately, however, few of these have been serious. The International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale was developed in 1990 by a group of experts around the world as a tool to promptly and consistently communicate to the public the safety significance of events associated with sources of ionizing radiation. The scale runs from 1 to 7, with 1 being considered an anomaly and 7 being considered a major accident. 6 of the top 10 disasters throughout history have been categorized as a level 5 accident with wider consequences or worse. Chernobyl, Fukushima, Kitsym, Windscale Fire, 3 Mile Island, and Golania. Following the 3 Mile Island incident in the U.S., there was no link in health problems with plants or animals. With only one historical incident to shape nuclear emergency preparedness efforts, officials rely on exercises to regularly revisit their planning and response strategies. All nuclear power plants are required to complete plume phase and ingestion phase exercises every 2 and 8 years, respectively. A plume phase exercise focuses on days 1 and 2 emergency actions in the 10-mile emergency planning zone, including establishing initial evacuation areas and food embargoes, whereas an ingestion phase exercise focuses on long-term ingestion exposure pathway protective action, decision-making, and implementation, including relocation, restricted zones, re-entry, and food embargo management in the 50-mile ingestion pathway zone. Within the United States, there are currently 99 operating reactors in 30 states, with 2 more under construction. Most of these are located east of the Mississippi River. Collectively, the reactors produce 20% of energy consumed in the U.S. Additionally, there are 31 licensed and operating research reactors, most of which are located at universities. These are non-power reactors used primarily for research, training, and development. The average age of commercial reactors in the U.S. is 36 years, with the oldest operating reactors entering service in 1969. In 2015, the Watts Bar Unit 2 nuclear power reactor in Tennessee became the first reactor authorized to operate since 1996. It was also the first plant to comply with the new orders from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission on Fukushima-related safety strategies. The Commission licenses U.S. commercial nuclear reactors for 40 years, at which time companies may apply for a 20-year extension. 85% of the currently operating reactors have received license renewals to operate for a total of 60 years. Radiological exposure to animals will have varying effects on their health and the wholesomeness of food products derived from them depending on a range of factors such as the radionuclide involved, environmental conditions experienced, dose received, and duration of exposure. Direct exposure to high-level radiation resulting in clinical signs in animals will likely lead to immediate carcass contamination and appropriate disposal, whereas countermeasures can be employed to safely harvest products from animals exposed to lower levels of radiation. Animals become exposed to radioactive fallout via 3 primary pathways. Direct contamination by exposure to radioactive fallout via skin or inhalation, exposure from contaminated drinking water, or exposure from contaminated soil. Water and soil contamination can both subsequently contaminate feed or forages. As an agriculture emergency coordinator planning for a nuclear disaster affecting animal agriculture, it is imperative that you understand the structure of modern agriculture in the U.S. For instance, 30 to 50 years ago, when many of the current nuclear power facilities were constructed and initial planning occurred, many animals were housed outdoors on a larger number of smaller farms. Now, a majority of dairy, swine, and poultry are housed under shelter year-round and fed feeds and forages that are also kept inside or otherwise sheltered. Few operations graze these animals. Fortunately, of dairy cattle that are grazing open pasture, most of them are dry cows, and thus milk contamination is not an immediate concern for them. As a result of these changing environmental conditions, the exposure of dairy cattle, swine, and poultry to direct contamination from fallout will be limited, as will their exposure to contaminated feedstuffs. The situation is reversed for most of the beef cattle, sheep, goat, and captive cervid industries, however. We will now discuss public health concerns associated with exposure of 3 of the more significant radionucleotides to livestock, all of which are readily transferred from animal feed to milk. It is important to understand that the radioactive decay or physical half-life of an isotope has no correlation to the biological half-life or the rate at which it is excreted from an animal. The actual dose and duration of exposure significantly affect the biological half-life. The first radionucleotide of significance is cesium-137. Its biological half-life in milk is up to 9 days. It distributes uniformly throughout the body, similar to that of potassium, but can concentrate in muscle tissues. The second radionucleotide of importance is strontium-90. Strontium mirrors the distribution and clearance of calcium throughout the body. Its biological half-life in milk is 10 to 40 hours. Finally, iodine-131 is completely absorbed in the animal's gastrointestinal tract and subsequently concentrates in the thyroid. From there, it is effectively transferred to milk and eggs. Because of its short physical half-life of 8 days, and because of the delay from when grazing cattle are harvested for meat consumption, lactating cows are the primary concern to the food chain with respect to iodine-131. Following exposure of animals to radionucleotides, there are a number of countermeasures that can be employed to reduce radioactivity in products derived from contaminated animals. Briefly, these include the management of land used for grazing or producing forage by selectively grazing or growing forage species with low potential for radionucleotide uptake. 2. Changes in animal management, particularly providing uncontaminated feedstuffs. Following the accident at Fukushima, research from the Graduate School of Agricultural and Life Sciences at the University of Tokyo looked at the effects of feeding haylage contaminated with cesium-137 to dairy cows on the radioactivity of milk. They found that the cesium was detected in the milk almost immediately after consumption of the contaminated feed and plateaued after 14 days. After changing the feedstuff to non-contaminated haylage, radioactivity quickly decreased and was again near the background level after 14 days. Similar results were obtained for animal meat, providing evidence that it is possible to decontaminate animals by feeding non-contaminated feeds. The third countermeasure is administration of binding agents or analogs to animals. One of these agents, Prussian blue, has proven to be the most cost-effective agricultural countermeasure employed in countries affected by Chernobyl. Successful trials utilizing its administration involved over 3,000 cows in 21 settlements in Belarus, 10,000 cows in 54 settlements in the Ukraine, and an unspecified number of cattle in Russian villages. Following this, the Minister of Agriculture in each state authorized the widespread use of Prussian blue in livestock to reduce the content of cesium-137 in milk and meat. This is believed to have benefited approximately 50,000 farmers in affected regions. In Belarus, an annual cost of $50,000 US has saved roughly $30 million US worth of milk and meat production each year. Number 4 is delayed animal slaughter, and the final countermeasure is food processing. In dairy products, radionucleotides are retained less in cream, while strontium-90 is 5 to 10 times higher in cheese than in milk due to the precipitation process in cheese production. Alternatively, butter does not contain any of the radionucleotides found in milk. Agroterrorism is defined as terrorist acts that are intended to disrupt or damage a country's agriculture, especially the use of a biological agent against crops or livestock. With examples dating back over 2,000 years, it is not a new concept. Fortunately, however, no documented attacks have occurred in the U.S. for many years. While agroterrorism remains a secondary consideration because it lacks the drama and spectacle of other types of terrorism, it nonetheless is a legitimate concern. In fact, when American and Allied forces overran al-Qaeda sanctuaries in the caves of eastern Afghanistan in 2002, among the thousands of documents they discovered were U.S. agricultural documents and an al-Qaeda training manual targeting agriculture. Why would al-Qaeda or another terrorist organization consider an attack on the U.S. food supply? There are a number of factors that make it attractive. The first and perhaps most appealing is the fact that an agroterrorism event would decimate U.S. agriculture and have a devastating effect on the nation's economy. Agriculture represents one of the largest sectors of the U.S. economy, accounting for $992 billion or 5.5% of the gross domestic product in 2015. Besides the direct cost to agriculture, there would undoubtedly be ripple effects into other sectors of society as well. In fact, a study cited by the National Institute for Animal Agriculture that evaluated the impact of foot and mouth disease on 60 farms in a single rural county in Kansas predicted operational costs of $1.4 million per week, with an additional local impact of $6.4 million per week to gross county product. This included the loss of 752 food manufacturing jobs, 1,466 retail jobs, 1,128 hospitality jobs, and 1,203 health and social services jobs. An agroterrorism attack in the U.S. would also undermine the public's confidence in the government and the safety of the food supply, something Americans largely take for granted each day. Terrorists could capitalize on this heightened state of public anxiety to create a general panic socially. Final considerations as to why terrorists might consider an attack on the food supply are that it could be an easy, low-tech, low-cost means to producing severe consequences. In fact, former Secretary of Health and Human Services Tommy Thompson remarked in his farewell address, "For the life of me, I cannot understand why the terrorists have not targeted our food supply because it is so easy to do." The following slides will highlight the ease and potential consequences of introducing what experts consider to be the worst-case scenario, foot and mouth disease, into the United States. Often referred to simply as FMD, foot and mouth disease has been eradicated from the United States since 1929. The disease affects all cloven-hooved or two-toed animals. This includes cattle, swine, small ruminants, and deer, but not horses. It is a disease of high morbidity but low mortality, meaning that while many animals become sick, few actually die from the illness. Clinical signs include fever and vesicular or blistering lesions on the hooves, tongue, and teats that cause painful discomfort. While most animals recover from the disease, they are left debilitated and at a significantly lower level of meat and milk production. There are 7 major serotypes of FMD that collectively contain approximately 65 strains. Because immunity against one strain is not necessarily cross-protective between strains within a serotype, it is challenging to develop a vaccine bank that will be effective in the face of an outbreak. So what about FMD makes it one of the most likely agents to be utilized in an agroterrorism event? For starters, unlike many of the more commonly discussed biological warfare agents such as smallpox and anthrax, FMD is easily acquired throughout the world. It is currently present in more than 100 countries on the continents of Africa, South America, Asia, the Middle East, and some parts of Europe, as shown by the red, beige, and light green colors on this map. A second feature of FMD that lends itself to its likely use as an agroterrorism agent is that it could be easily introduced via a number of modalities, including diseased animals or contaminated food, hay, feed, hides, biologics, clothing, or equipment. The virus could easily be isolated from an infected animal, transported back to the U.S. via any of the aforementioned media, and then be introduced into the U.S. livestock industry. It could be as simple as dropping a contaminated handkerchief among curious livestock along the road. At that point, because FMD is so contagious, 20 times more than smallpox, with an airborne transmission range of 50 miles, the animals themselves would weaponize it. Due to the density and regular transportation of livestock, it is estimated that an FMD outbreak could spread to as many as 25 states in as few as 5 days. Finally, FMD is non-zoonotic, so it poses no threat to the perpetrator. As a result of all of these features, FMD could easily be spread throughout the U.S. with very little cost, expertise, or harm to a terrorist. With 10-year revenue losses predicted by the National Institute for Animal Agriculture at billions upon billions of dollars, even by industries such as poultry that are not directly affected by the disease, it's easy to see why FMD is considered the worst-case scenario for an agroterrorism attack. Our discussion will now advance to the topic of One Health. A plethora of definitions for the concept of One Health exists, but central to all of them is the idea that One Health is a collaborative effort of multiple disciplines working together locally, nationally, and globally to attain optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. While the term and its awareness is relatively new, the idea of One Health has been around for many years. Rudolf Virchow, a German scholar from the mid-1880s, is often cited as one of the earliest proponents of One Health. He stated, "Between animal and human medicine there is no dividing line, nor should there be. The object is different, but the experience obtained constitutes the basis of all medicine." A zoonotic disease, or zoonosis, is any disease or infection that is naturally transmissible from vertebrate animals to humans and vice versa. Over 200 diseases representing all types of pathogenic agents have been described as zoonotic. These include bacteria, parasites, fungi, and viruses. Zoonoses are of increasing importance to the medical community as they comprise 75% of recently emerging diseases, 60% of all human pathogens, and 80% of potential bioterrorism agents. This table lists examples of zoonotic pathogens in each of the disease classes. Other health threats, such as antimicrobial resistance, also exist at the human-animal ecosystems interface. One may query why an increasing portion of emerging diseases are zoonotic. Several factors contribute to the increased opportunity for diseases to pass between animals and people. These include human populations growing and expanding into new geographic areas, which puts people in closer contact with wild and domestic animals, facilitating the spread of disease between animals and people. Additionally, changes in land use and climate lead to disruptions in environmental conditions and habitats, altering the interaction of animals and people. Building off this discussion of changing interactions with people and animals, we will now briefly discuss wildlife, a component of One Health that should not be omitted, especially when it comes to discussions on disease control. Rodents, wild birds, deer, and feral swine are among the populations of greatest concern regarding the spread of disease in an outbreak scenario. Wild birds are viewed as reservoirs for avian influenza A viruses, which have been isolated from over 100 different species of wild birds. Most of these viruses are low pathogenicity avian influenza, though highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N2 that was responsible for the 2015 outbreak in the U.S., was also detected in wild birds. At this time, little is known about the role wildlife plays in spreading the disease to domestic poultry. After nearly going extinct at the beginning of the 20th century, the deer populations in the U.S. has recovered to its historical size of around 30 million deer. Deer can harbor not only diseases such as FMD that are of critical concern to the livestock industry, but also a number of zoonotic diseases. The American Veterinary Medical Association advises hunters against just over 30 diseases representing all classes of pathogens except fungi. Also known as wild boars, wild hogs, razorbacks, and Eurasian boars, feral swine are ravaging the United States. Their population has rapidly expanded over the last 30 years to now exceed 6 million in at least 35 states. They are destructive, costing the U.S. an estimated $1.5 billion every year in damages and control costs. More pertinent to this discussion, however, is the fact that they can carry at least 30 diseases and nearly 40 types of parasites that affect not only other hogs, but also people, pets, livestock, and wildlife. Feral swine are extremely intelligent, adaptable creatures with a lack of natural predators, a set of traits that has facilitated their population growth at increasing rates. A paper published in 2017 by researchers at the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, National Wildlife Research Center, predicted that if this trend persists, feral swine will be found in most U.S. counties within the next 30 to 50 years, or even faster if southward expansion from Canada continues. Gail Karn, a public affairs specialist at the USDA APHIS Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center, summarized the threat of feral swine like this. Feral swine cause major damage to property, agriculture, crops and livestock, native species and ecosystems, and cultural and historic resources. This invasive species also threatens the health of people, wildlife, pets, and other domestic animals. As feral swine populations continue to expand across the country, these damages, costs, and risks will only keep rising. The final portion of our discussion will focus on changing strategies of contemporary ag emergency management planning. As alluded to in previous sections, animal agriculture has changed drastically in the last 50 years, let alone in the last century. It used to be that nearly every home had a few head of different types of animals to provide their family with meat, milk, eggs, and other products. Farms gradually became larger and fewer to where there are now large specialized operations with many modern efficiencies built in. As a result of the changing livestock industries in the United States, agriculture emergency response strategies must also continue to change if they are to be most effective in the face of an event. Two large paradigm shifts have occurred in the agriculture emergency response community over the last 15 to 20 years. Officials have determined it is no longer wise to rely on stop movement and stamping out to control large disease outbreaks. Large herds, extensive movement of animals, high livestock density, public resistance to stamping out, carcass disposal issues, and large feral swine and deer populations all curb the ability for these traditional strategies to be effective. It is important to note, however, that stamping out is still relied upon in the very early stages of detection of an FAD and by the poultry industry for control of highly pathogenic avian influenza. The housing conditions and size of birds make this possible compared to other types of livestock operations. Officials used to rely on prolonged stop movement orders to limit the spread of disease in the face of an outbreak. Such a situation almost immediately creates substantial animal welfare concerns for the egg, dairy, and swine industries, not to mention environmental issues and economic losses. Increased focus on continuity of business in order to minimize disruptions to the normal flow of animals and products has led to the development of the secure food supply plans and practice of permitted movement. Implementation of permitted movement was fundamental in maintaining continuity of business during the 2014-15 highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. Approximately 8,000 permits were issued, enabling more than 20,000 movements. Continuity of business is the management of animals and products that are in a control area or the area surrounding an infected premises where the response efforts are focused. Animals and products in control areas are therefore affected by a disease outbreak, but are not actually infected. Continuity of business provides science and risk-based approaches and systems to help agriculture and food industries maintain typical business or return to business during a disease response while effectively mitigating the spread of disease. Development of the secure food supply plans began with secure egg supply in 2007. Since then, more plans have been added and continue to undergo development. The plans focus on maintaining continuity of business and a continuous supply of wholesome food to consumers in the face of a disease response. Components shared between plans include voluntary pre-outbreak preparedness, biosecurity, surveillance, epidemiology questionnaires, movement permit guidance, risk assessments, and pre- and post-outbreak training. A second fundamental strategy in animal disease outbreak management that has changed in the last 15 years is the policy of stamping out versus utilization of vaccination. In 2001, the United Kingdom and Uruguay suffered from extensive FMD outbreaks. While the two countries are approximately the same size in land area, Uruguay's cattle population was over 6.5 times larger than the UK's. The UK, however, had more sheep and hogs. The two countries faced a similar incidence of FMD, but their response approaches were drastically different. The UK employed a stamping out policy with no vaccination and consequently slaughtered 6 million head of livestock. The outbreak cost the country's agriculture and food sector approximately $5 billion US, with an additional $5 billion US lost to tourism. Uruguay, on the other hand, utilized very little stamping out and relied heavily on vaccination. As a result, only 6,900 head of livestock were killed. The cost of Uruguay's outbreak was $243.6 million US, less than 1/40th of the cost in the UK. The two outbreaks lasted about the same length of time. With examples such as these to draw on, and greater concern for the environmental impacts and feasibility of these differing strategies, USDA currently promotes 5 different response strategies to an FMD outbreak in the FMD Red Book. These utilize vaccination and stamping out in various combinations to control the spread of disease. For more information on these scenarios, please refer to the Red Book. As you complete this training and continue to grow in your new duties as an agriculture emergency coordinator, it will be vital to intimately learn about your state's political environment, agriculture industries, and more. Organization and authorities differ between states regarding the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture compared to a Division of Animal Health or similarly named entity. Delve into the specifics of this and become familiar with the roles of your colleagues in other state agencies as well. Become acquainted with the major livestock industries represented in your state, as well as any niches in agriculture production. Meet with representatives from the industries and ask to tour different kinds of facilities so you have a first-hand understanding of how these entities operate. You can also learn about your state's approach to agriculture emergency management by studying previous large-scale disease or all hazards events. What were the lessons learned, and how have they shaped current policies? What does your state have regarding an emergency response plan? Is it somehow included in the State Emergency Operations Plan, or is it an independent document? How long ago were it and other planning documents, such as Standard Operating Procedures, or SOPs, last updated? How does your state control the movement of animals and animal products in the case of an event impacting animal health? And finally, terminology utilized in your state may differ slightly from that presented in this training. Learn to talk the talk with those around you. You will undoubtedly begin to interact with other professionals in a number of different settings and roles. Take a moment to glance through this list and consider reaching out to individuals in some of these capacities to learn more about what they do and how you can serve each other. The National Livestock Readiness Program website aims to serve as a clearinghouse for ag emergency response resources. Please visit the website to find resources for planning, training, response activities, and more.